Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be doing a video entitled Why Political Correctness Fails. Now, political correctness, loosely defined as the use of particular terms or phrases with the goal of not causing offense, particularly to traditionally marginalized groups, has been maligned for a wide variety of reasons, from its illiberal aversion to free speech to the arbitrariness of its labels, which are often rejected or at least disagreed on by the groups that they intend to empower. Following a brief examination of these critiques, this video is going to focus on a new criticism of political correctness, aimed not at its morality or accuracy, but rather at its efficacy of actually empowering marginalized groups. Let's take a look. So, arbitrating what people can and cannot say seems deeply antithetical to traditional liberal values of freedom and open discourse, and could easily be used by authoritarians to stifle all criticism. Support for policies that curtail free speech in favor of political correctness have been a signal of the rise of the quote-unquote illiberal left, which have abandoned traditional ideas of liberalism in favor of beliefs driven by a narrative of social privilege and oppression. See our video on free speech versus political correctness for more on this specific critique. Another common critique of political correctness is that there is disagreement within marginalized groups as to what they want to be called. Controversy around the use of the term Latinx, which has been used by many media and politicians, but is broadly not accepted by many people of Hispanic descent, to whom it is referring, is one example. Others include disagreement on quote-unquote person-first versus identity-first language. For example, many members of the deaf community prefer identity-first language, deaf people, not people with deafness, while members of other disability communities prefer person-first language, people with disabilities, not disabled people. And there is broad disagreement on many of these kinds of terms, and so there's a question of should socially people be pressuring others to use a specific term when there's not agreement even within the communities around the correct term to use. Proponents of this critique argue for a kind of particularism, essentially that the problem with political correctness is that we can't come up with terms that will be satisfactory to everyone of a given group, and we shouldn't try to. Rather, we should ask an individual what they would like to be called and call them that, but not worry about trying to find the perfect term for a large group, because inevitably any term will offend someone. However, the critique that this video fits into neither of these claims. Rather, it focuses on the efficacy of political correctness to successfully diminish the harmful impacts of particular terms. Basically, the case here is that political correctness merely moves the stigma to another term. It does not actually address the underlying bigotry. And if that bigotry is not addressed, the new term will soon take on a negative connotation that is equally harmful. The point is that changing or policing terminology does not actually change behavior or counteract bigotry. Political correctness therefore fails to accomplish its underlying goal of diminishing the harmful impact of terms. To illustrate this, we should first seek to understand the goal of political correctness. Imagine a particular marginalized group, call them Group M. This group has been seen negatively by society, perhaps due to poverty, a difference of culture, residual historical grievances, and therefore they've been marginalized and lack privilege in many spaces. The society at large refers to this group using term X. The group associates that term with the negative perception of them in society and is in fact used as a slur. This means that whenever someone is referred to by that term, they feel dejected. It causes harm because it brings up all of those feelings and those of negative marginalization. A quick side note when I say harm. There's a disagreement as to whether a word can truly cause harm. For now, we're going to concede the point, and we will revisit this assumption later in the video. If you are interested in the debate around speech and harm, check out our video on John Stuart Mill's harm principle. Now, at this point, political correctness steps in and says term X is causing group M harm. We need to use a different term. So some term is decided upon. Call it term Y. However, even if the proponents of political correctness are successful in changing the use of the term from term X to term Y, if they have not succeeded in getting rid of the stigma and the bigotry associated with Group M, term Y will eventually become just as negatively coded. The fallacy in this thinking is the claim that words with negative connotations cause stigma, not the other way around. If stigma causes words to have negative meaning, then changing the words only temporarily delays them reacquiring a negative meaning. Yesterday's dog whistle is tomorrow's slur. And people don't often realize this because it can take a generation or two for that change to occur. And so there may be a temporary benefit when a word that is used that has a positive connotation retains that positive connotation. But unless the underlying bigotry and marginalization is addressed, eventually that term itself can begin to take on those negative connotations and can essentially begin to be a euphemism for the slur, and therefore eventually be just as bad as the slur because it takes on all of those negative connotations. An example of this cycle can be seen in the use of words to refer to black people in America. Initially, by many sources, even the N-word was considered simply descriptive, not pejorative, though given the horrible treatment of slaves, it quickly gained a strong negative connotation. Later, words like Negro or colored replaced it as more politically correct versions of the word. And we can see that they were considered politically correct in things like titles like the NAACP. But even these fell out of favor because the underlying inequities that existed and the underlying biases that existed had not been rectified. And so these words came to become associated with the Jim Crow laws in the South and therefore regained that negative connotation. And clearly it took time, and clearly there was a positive benefit for a period of those words being used. But those words eventually regained a negative connotation because we hadn't addressed the underlying bigotry. We had simply papered over it with a new word. Even more recently, words like minorities gained negative connotation due to their use by police to negatively describe non-white populations or suspects. In fact, some studies have found that simply being reminded of or primed with one's race at all, even in the most PC terms possible, can have detrimental impacts on test performance for black students. The fact that the impact of this so-called stereotype threat could persist regardless of the terms used indicates that at least some of the harm, though likely not all, derived from slurs cannot be eliminated by changing the terms, as simply reminding someone whose race has a negative stereotype or has been marginalized in the past of their race will have deleterious impacts on their performance and therefore do harm in some way. This brings us back to words and harm. In these ways, one might argue that speech can cause real harm. However, if any reference to race causes some degree of harm, it would seem that the only way to eliminate such harm would be to have a post-racial society. However, this raises a number of other issues, such as how a failing to acknowledge or quote-unquote see race can lead to an underappreciation of racist structures that still exist. Once again, having the issue of not addressing the underlying problems of racism within a society and simply trying to paper them over. For a further discussion of this debate, particularly between Senghor and Sartre, see our video on the philosophy of négritude. Now, the point of this is not in any way to advocate for the use of archaic or offensive racist slurs, but rather to point out the ineffectiveness of political correctness in actually mitigating harm, so long as the underlying stereotypes and bigotry exists. Whatever term is arrived at will eventually gain a negative connotation. Focusing on policing political correctness allows those in power to feel like they are doing something without actually making real sacrifices that would address the underlying causes of disparities. While everyone's arguing about what words to use, those in power can continue to oppress those out of power without anyone trying to check them, because everyone who cares about this is so busy worrying about what words they should be using when they could be worrying about what policies they can be changing. At worst, political correctness can stifle real debate on issues and provide those in power with an excuse to not take real action, instead opting for performative activism of policing speech in place of addressing true inequalities. Further, it can mask inequities that allow people to claim they have fixed an issue when all they have done is renamed it. It seems to be kind to call individuals what they want to be called, and perhaps once we've addressed the underlying bigotry, finding new words is appropriate. But claiming that there's one right way to refer to all people in a group and arguing that changing the words alone will change the underlying disparities, or changing the words first and hoping the disparities follow, seems lazy at best and actively detrimental to equality by papering over the actual issues at worst. Whew. A big thank you to Horace Chan for supporting Carneades.org on Patreon since 2018. You too can support the channel and get access to Patreon exclusive posts for just $2 a month, less than the price of buying me a cup of coffee once a month. If you want to support public philosophy, please do consider donating. Whew, this is a heavy issue. What do you think? Is political correctness actually effective at reducing harm? Or does it only mask harm and shift negative connotations to new words? Is this a convincing argument? Or do you think that those new words actually do reduce harm in some way, even if they begin to build negative connotations as they are used over time and today's euphemism becomes tomorrow's dog whistle and the next day's slur? Leave me your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe if you like this video, and hit that notification bell if you want to make sure you don't miss another video from Carneades.org. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.